At Kensington Palace, there was a particular kind of morning that the staff learned to recognize before it fully arrived. Not by the light through the windows, not by the hour on the clock, but by sound. The sound of footsteps that moved too quickly for the carpet, the sound of a door that did not quite slam, but closed with a decision behind it, the sound of a voice carrying from one room into the next, bright and warm on the surface, with something underneath it that made experienced hands pause mid-task and recalibrate. A senior housemaid had been working in royal households long enough to know that the title on the door told you very little about what waited behind it. She had served women who carried their rank like armor, and women who wore it like a costume they could not wait to remove. She had learned early that the most dangerous people in a palace were not the ones who shouted. Shouting was honest. Shouting told you exactly where you stood. The dangerous ones were the ones who smiled while they moved the ground beneath your feet. She was carrying fresh towels through the upper corridor when she heard it. The particular quality of silence that follows a telephone call that has not gone the way someone wanted. She slowed without meaning to. In palace work, slowing down near the wrong door was its own kind of risk, but the body learned things the mind could not always explain. The door opened before she reached it. Princess Diana stood in the frame wearing a pale blue dressing gown, hair not yet arranged, face bare of the careful construction that the cameras received every time she stepped into public, without the makeup, without the particular smile that had become famous enough to be studied and imitated across the world. She looked younger than her age, and older than she should have. Her eyes moved to the housemaid with a speed that felt almost like surveillance. The housemaid stopped. She dipped her head in the correct way. She said good morning in the correct tone, which in that household meant warm but not familiar, present but not intrusive, human but not quite a person. Diana looked at the towels, then she looked at the housemaid, then she looked at the towels again as if they had appeared from somewhere suspicious. "I did not ask for those," she said. Her voice was soft. That was one of the things that confused people who had only seen her from a distance. They expected volume, because her presence was so large, because rooms reorganized themselves around her when she entered, because photographers had spent years capturing the way light seemed to choose her specifically. They expected that a woman who could fill a stadium with feeling would raise her voice when she was displeased. She did not raise it, she lowered it. And the lowering was the thing that made the housemaid's hands tighten slightly around the folded fabric. "I understand, ma'am," the housemaid said. The rotation schedule had changed this morning. She kept her voice even. Even was the safest register. Even did not invite escalation and did not suggest challenge. Diana tilted her head. It was a gesture the world knew, slightly sideways, chin angled down, eyes looking up. The photographers had caught it 10,000 times, and the public had read it as vulnerability, as shyness, as the beautiful uncertainty of a woman still finding herself. The housemaid had seen it used in a different way often enough to understand that it was not always those things. Sometimes it was an assessment. Sometimes it was the look of a person deciding how much pressure to apply and to whom. "The rotation schedule," Diana repeated. She said it lightly, as if the phrase itself was mildly amusing. As if the concept of a rotation schedule for towels was the funniest small thing she had encountered this week. The housemaid waited. Waiting was a skill. In that house it was perhaps the most important skill of all. Diana stepped back from the door frame. She said nothing further. She left the door open in a way that was not exactly an invitation, and not exactly a dismissal, which was its own kind of instruction. The housemaid understood. She set the towels down in the bathroom with careful hands, straightened them twice, and withdrew without making a sound. In the corridor she passed a footman she had worked alongside for 3 years. He glanced at her face and read it the way people in that profession learn to read faces, quickly, accurately, and without asking questions that might draw attention to the reading. He said nothing, she said nothing. She continued down the corridor with the particular pace that palace staff develop over time. Not hurried enough to suggest alarm, not slow enough to suggest ease. The pace that says everything is perfectly fine and means something considerably more complicated. She would think about that morning later, in the way you think about things that don't quite resolve into a clean story. Because that was the difficulty with Princess Diana.
The moments were never clean. They did not arrange themselves into the simple narrative the world wanted, which was either the fairy tale or the tragedy. They were something messier and more human and harder to explain to someone who had not been in the room.
What the world knew about Diana in those years was substantial and curated. It knew about the dress with the plunging neckline worn to a function the night Charles appeared on television to discuss their separation. It knew about the landmines and the leprosy wards, and the way she could hold a dying stranger's hand and make them feel they were the only person in the world. It knew about the Panorama interview and the eyes that looked directly into the camera, and the phrase "there were three of us in this marriage," which lodged itself into the language of an entire generation. What the world did not know, or knew only in fragments that it chose not to assemble, was what happened in the spaces between the images. What happened in corridors and kitchens and private rooms where there were no cameras and no journalists and no carefully chosen friends feeding carefully chosen information to carefully chosen reporters. What happened in those spaces was what the staff knew. Staff always know first. This is not gossip, it is geography. They are present in the rooms before the principal arrives and present after the principal leaves. They see the morning face and the late night face and every face in between. They see what happens when the performance ends and what happens when the performance resumes. They are, in the way of people who are expected to be invisible, the most reliable witnesses in any royal household. And in the household of Princess Diana, what the staff witnessed over the years of her marriage and her separation and her strange, fierce public life built a picture that was different from the one in the newspapers. Not entirely different, that is important. Diana was genuinely kind in ways that could take your breath away. She could remember a junior staff member's mother's illness and ask about it 6 months later, with what appeared to be and perhaps was genuine concern. She could walk into a room where someone was struggling and find them, specifically among everyone else, and say something that landed exactly where it needed to land. She had a gift for human connection that was real and not entirely manufactured, and the people who served her saw it operate at close range and understood it was not nothing. But gifts and habits are not the same thing, and the habits that the public never saw, the patterns that played out behind closed doors in the years of her royal life, painted a more complicated portrait than the one that stared from the covers of magazines. The staff learned the rules early, not from a manual. There was no manual for this. They learned from each other, passed down in the quiet language of people who share an unusual profession. They learned that Diana's moods did not follow the logic of what had actually happened. A good event could produce a bad evening. A kind word from a stranger in public could arrive home as something edged and difficult. They learned that the line between her warmth and her sharpness was not where you expected it, not drawn between people she liked and people she did not drawn between good days and bad ones, but somewhere more internal and therefore more unpredictable. They learned that the telephone was an instrument of weather. When calls went well, the household breathed. When they did not, you heard it in the quality of the silence afterward. They learned that loyalty in that house was tested in small ways constantly, and that the testing was not always conscious but was always real. They learned that Diana noticed everything, which could be wonderful and could be exhausting and was always, in the end, a form of power. They also learned something that took longer to name, but that the more experienced among them understood clearly. Diana's difficulties were not separable from her gifts. The same attention that made her remarkable in a hospital ward, the same radar that let her find the one person in a room who was suffering and go directly to them, that same quality turned inward and outward in ways that were not always comfortable. She felt everything, and what she felt she distributed. Sometimes the distribution was generous, sometimes it was something else entirely. The housemaid who had carried the towels that morning would serve in that household for several more years. She would witness things that confirmed her early reading and things that complicated it. She would see Diana sit on a kitchen floor at midnight talking to a junior cook with the directness of someone who has decided that a person is worth her full attention, and she would see her the following morning dismiss a footman with a look that made him stand very still for a moment afterward. The way people stand when something has hit them that they are not yet ready to name. She would eventually leave palace service, as most do, and she would find that the experience did not arrange itself into the simple version people expected when they learned where she had worked. They wanted either the fairy tale confirmed or the fairy tale destroyed. They wanted a verdict. The housemaid did not have a verdict. She had memories, specific and complicated, of a woman who was capable of remarkable things and difficult things in roughly equal measure, and who moved through the world with an intensity that left marks on everyone around her. But in the corridors below stairs, in the quiet conversations that happen after a long shift, when the principals are behind their doors and the staff are briefly allowed to be themselves, there was a phrase that circulated. Not shouted, not posted anywhere, just spoken, sometimes, when someone had had a particularly instructive day, spoken with the weary precision of people who have direct experience and are not interested in romance about it. She could be a nasty piece of work, they would say, and no one in the room would argue, and no one would say it was the whole story either. Because in that world you learnt to hold two true things at once: the woman who could make a dying child feel loved, and the woman who could make a grown professional feel worthless with a softly delivered sentence and a slight tilt of her head. To understand how someone becomes both of those things, you have to go back. Not to the palace, not to the wedding that the whole world watched and called a fairy tale, even as the two people inside it were already understanding what a mistake looked like up close. You have to go back further, to a house in Norfolk where a little girl was learning early, and at considerable personal cost, that love was not a reliable thing, and that attention in all its forms was the only currency that really mattered. You have to go back to before the cameras found her, before the dress and the ring and the name that would eventually become its own separate country in the public imagination. You have to go back to Diana Spencer, who was not yet a princess and not yet a symbol, who was simply a child growing up inside a family that was breaking apart in ways that left marks that no amount of public adoration would ever fully cover. Because the staff who served her knew, and they knew it from the beginning, that the woman who arrived at the palace gates in 1981 had already been shaped by forces that the palace did not fully reckon with, and the palace's failure to reckon with them would cost everyone around her, including Diana herself, more than any of them anticipated on that bright morning when the world lined the streets and wept with happiness and called it a fairy tale. It was not a fairy tale. The staff could have told you that. Some of them tried, in the careful sideways language of people who understand what they risk. Most of them did not try at all. They simply learned the rules. They straightened their jackets, they answered the bell. And they remembered. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs specifically to children of privilege. It is not the loneliness of poverty or hunger or the absence of material comfort. It is harder to name than those things, and easier to dismiss, which makes it more dangerous in its way. It is the loneliness of large rooms and absent parents, and the understanding that arrives too early, before the vocabulary exists to process it, that the people who are supposed to choose you above everything else have found other things to choose instead. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The house sat on land leased from the royal family, which was in its way a small piece of foreshadowing that nobody noticed at the time. Her father was Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, a man of considerable lineage and the particular emotional restraint that the English aristocracy had spent centuries perfecting into something that looked like dignity and functioned more often like distance. Her mother was Frances Ruth Burke Roche, a woman of energy and appetite and a restlessness that the structures of her marriage could not contain. Diana was the third child. She was also, in a way that mattered enormously in that family and that era, the wrong kind of third child. Her parents had two daughters already, Sarah and Jane, and what they needed, what the Spencer line required in the way that aristocratic lines have always required things from the people born into them, was a son, a male heir. The pressure of that requirement had shaped the atmosphere of the household long before Diana arrived into it, and when she arrived a girl again, the disappointment was not spoken but was present in the way that unspoken things are always more present than spoken ones. There had been a boy before her,
a son born between Jane and Diana who had lived only 10 hours. His name was John. His brief existence and his death had left a grief in the household that was never properly processed, because in that world grief was not something you processed. It was something you wore appropriately for the correct period and then folded away. The folding did not make it disappear, it made it weigh. Diana grew up in that weight without knowing entirely what she was carrying.
Her brother Charles was born 3 years after her, and with his arrival the pressure on the household shifted. The heir existed. The line was secured, but Diana, caught between the older girls and the finally arrived boy, occupied a position in the family architecture that had no clear name. She was not the eldest, shaping herself into the future. She was not the youngest, occupying the particular territory of the baby. She was the middle daughter in a family that was already fracturing along lines she was too young to map. Park House itself was a place of a particular kind of grandeur, large enough to require staff, formal enough to maintain distance between the children and the adults who managed the household, situated on the edge of the royal estate in a way that meant the children grew up aware, always, that there was a larger world nearby that operated on rules they had not yet been taught, but were somehow already expected to understand. The royal family's presence at Sandringham was a seasonal fact of life. The children played on the same land. The proximity was entirely normal from the inside, and entirely extraordinary from every other angle. Diana as a child was described by people who knew her then in terms that feel, in retrospect, like early drafts of the woman she became. She was sensitive, they said. Sensitive was the polite word that adults used for children who felt things too much and showed it. She cried easily. She was affected by the distress of others in a way that seemed almost physical, as if their pain was something she absorbed rather than observed. She was also stubborn in the specific way of children who have learned that the world does not automatically organize itself around their needs and have decided to organize it themselves. She was funny, with the quick instinctive humor of someone paying very close attention to the people around them, and she was, in the way that would define her entire life, hungry for attention in a manner that the adults around her found sometimes charming and sometimes exhausting. She was not an academic child. This was noted with the particular combination of concern and dismissal that English institutions reserve for children who do not perform well on paper. She failed her O-levels twice. She struggled with formal learning in ways that were attributed at the time to a lack of application and understood only much later as something more complicated, a mind that worked differently, that absorbed emotional information with extraordinary efficiency and found the retrieval of facts from textbooks correspondingly difficult. She was not unintelligent. She was intelligent in ways that the schools she attended were not equipped to recognize or reward. What Diana was good at, even as a very young child, was people. She could read a room in the way that some people read music, instinctively and with a kind of physical pleasure. She could feel the emotional temperature of a gathering and adjust her own behavior in response with a speed that was not calculated exactly but not purely instinct either. It was something in between, a skill that had been developed by necessity in a household where emotional temperatures changed without warning, and where the ability to sense the shift before it arrived was the difference between safety and something less comfortable. Because the household did change, and the change when it came was the defining catastrophe of Diana's early life. In 1967, when Diana was 6 years old, her mother left. Francis Spencer had fallen in love with another man, a wallpaper heir named Peter Shand Kidd, and the marriage to Johnny Spencer had reached the point that some marriages reach where the distance between two people has become too great to bridge with duty or appearance or the management of a household. She left. She took the children initially, or tried to, and then the custody battle that followed was one of those legal proceedings that leave marks on everyone involved that the legal language cannot adequately describe. Francis lost custody. This was unusual for the time, and has been attributed to various factors, including testimony from her own mother, Lady Fermoy, who sided with the Spencer family against her own daughter, in a move that Diana would later describe with a clarity that suggested it had never stopped being vivid. Frances was painted as the woman who had abandoned her children for a lover. The narrative was not entirely fair, and not entirely unfair, and it was, in the way of all narratives, considerably simpler than the truth. What mattered for Diana was not the legal verdict. What mattered was the experience of being 6 years old and understanding that her mother was gone, that the person who had been the emotional center of her world had chosen to leave it. Children at 6 do not have the tools to process that information correctly. They do not understand the adult complexities of failed marriages or the difference between leaving a husband and leaving children. They understand only the fact of the absence, and they draw from that fact a conclusion that no adult in their life will quite manage to dislodge. She left. Therefore something about me made her leave. Diana never said this in those words, at least not in any record that survives. But the pattern of her later behavior, the constant need for reassurance, the terror of abandonment, the way she could be generous and then suddenly punishing when she felt someone was pulling away, the exhausting intensity of her need to be loved and chosen and placed above everything else, all of it traces a direct line back to that morning in 1967 when her mother's departure became a permanent fact. The children were raised largely at Park House and later at Althorpe after their grandfather died, and Johnny Spencer inherited the earldom. Johnny Spencer was not a cruel man. People who knew him well described him with genuine affection. He was simply a product of his time and his class and his own emotional history, which meant that he did not know how to talk to his children about feelings. He did not know how to talk to them about the divorce. He did not know how to be the emotional presence that 4 children needed in the aftermath of their mother's departure, and so he provided the material things with considerable conscientiousness and the emotional things hardly at all. The children had nannies, a succession of them. Diana's relationship with these women was complicated and revealing. She attached herself to some of them with an intensity that alarmed the more experienced among them. She could be devoted and demanding in equal measure, generous with her affection, and quick to withdraw it if she felt it was not being returned at the correct temperature. Nannies who met her need for closeness were adored. Nannies who maintained professional distance were viewed as a form of betrayal. One nanny was reportedly pushed down the stairs, though the details of this incident are contested and difficult to verify at this distance. What is not contested is that Diana as a child was not easy to manage. She felt things enormously, and she expressed what she felt without much filtering, and she expected the people around her to organize themselves around her emotional reality in ways that were not always reasonable and were always in her mind entirely justified. She went to boarding school at Riddlesworth Hall at the age of 9, then to West Heath School in Kent. These were the schools that girls of her background attended, which meant they were environments of considerable social complexity where status was maintained through a combination of family name and social fluency and the unspoken cruelties that institutions of that kind generate between young women figuring out their place in a hierarchy that nobody has officially explained to them. Diana was not the most popular girl at school. She was liked, but liked in the way of someone whose emotional intensity is appealing in short doses and tiring in longer ones. She was kind to younger girls and to anyone she perceived as struggling, with a genuine warmth that teachers noted. She won an award at Westheath for service to the school, and the citation described her help with a local old people's home, where she reportedly spent time with elderly residents with a patience and presence that was remarked upon by the staff there. But she was also at school the girl who cried. Not occasionally, regularly. The girl who felt slights with an acuteness that her peers sometimes found uncomfortable. The girl whose need for reassurance from the people she had chosen to care about was large enough to be felt as pressure, even when it was expressed as affection. Her closest friends from those years describe her with the careful warmth of people who loved her and also found her difficult, who were drawn to her brightness and sometimes overwhelmed by its heat. She failed her O-levels the first time, and then again. She left Westheath without academic qualifications and went briefly to a finishing school in Switzerland called the Institut Alpin Wiedemannet,
which she hated with an efficiency that left little room for ambiguity. She lasted 6 weeks. She came home. She moved to London, to a flat in Colherne Court that her parents bought her, and she began the period of her life that the biographers have described with various degrees of sentimentality as her normal years. They were not entirely normal. The flat in Colherne Court was shared with flatmates, and the life she lived there had the shape of ordinariness: the cleaning jobs, the work as a nursery teacher's assistant at the Young England kindergarten, the cooking and the socializing, and the particular London existence of a young woman of good family without a fixed trajectory. But the context was never ordinary. The Spencer name carried weight. The connections to the royal family through the Sandringham years and her father's role as an equerry to both George VI and Elizabeth II meant that Diana moved through London society with a particular positioning even before anyone knew she was important.
And she was, even then, already noticed. Not yet famous, but I noticed. The people who encountered her in those years describe her consistently in terms that echo what the palace staff would later say from the other end of the experience. She was magnetic, she was warm, she could make you feel, in a 30-second conversation, that she had been waiting specifically for the chance to talk to you. She was also, in the view of some who knew her well, someone whose emotional needs were large in ways that were not always immediately apparent, because they arrived wrapped in warmth and charm and the particular vulnerability of a young woman who seemed both fragile and fierce in alternating measures. She was 19 when the relationship with Charles began in any serious sense. She was not, as the fairy tale version required, an innocent with no understanding of what was happening. She was a young woman who had grown up adjacent to that world, who understood its codes, who had watched her sister Sarah date Charles briefly years earlier, and had absorbed the lesson of that episode with the attention she applied to everything she genuinely wanted to understand. She was not naive. She was young, which is different, and she was, underneath the warmth and the humor and the considerable social fluency, a person who had been shaped by loss and abandonment into someone who needed, with a depth that would take years and considerable damage to understand, to be chosen absolutely and without reservation. The palace would not choose her absolutely. The palace did not know how to choose anyone in that way. The palace chose institutions and continuity and the management of appearances. It was the wrong place entirely for a woman whose fundamental wound was the experience of not being chosen, and whose fundamental gift was making other people feel they had been. The collision, when it came, would be spectacular. The staff who watched it happen from the inside would spend years trying to find language for what they had witnessed. Some of them eventually found it, some of them never did. All of them, in the careful private conversations that palace workers have when the doors are closed and the principals are elsewhere, agreed on at least one thing. They had known from early on, not what would happen specifically, not the full shape of the disaster, but the shape of it was coming. You could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, in a particular quality of the air, in the behavior of things that are sensitive to pressure. Diana Spencer became Diana, Princess of Wales, on the 29th of July 1981, in front of 750 million people. She was 20 years old. She had known Charles for approximately 13 months in any serious capacity. She was not in love with him, or was in love with the idea of him, which is a different thing and a far more dangerous one. And she walked into the most scrutinized institution in the world carrying, along with the Spencer tiara and the 25-foot train, every wound that had been written into her by a childhood that the world knew nothing about and the palace had not thought to ask about. The staff would meet her soon enough. They would learn the rules of her household with the efficiency of professionals who understand that survival requires accurate information quickly acquired. They would see the warmth, and they would see the other thing. They would carry both pieces of knowledge the way palace staff always carry things, with discretion, with discipline, and with the particular weariness of people who have understood something important that they are not allowed to say out loud. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February, 1981. And the world received it the way the world receives things it has decided in advance to love, with noise and certainty and the particular warmth of a collective feeling that does not invite examination. The photographs taken that day show a young woman in a blue suit standing beside a man 12 years her senior, both of them smiling, both of them saying the correct things into the microphones that had been arranged for exactly this purpose. When a journalist asked if they were in love, Diana said of course, and Charles said whatever love means, and the world heard Diana's answer and not Charles's, because Diana's answer was the one the story required. The staff heard both. This is the thing about working inside a royal household at the moment of a significant announcement. The announcement is designed for the outside. It has been crafted and timed and worded with considerable care by people whose entire professional purpose is the management of public perception. What the staff experience is the inside of the announcement, the hours before it, the atmosphere in the rooms where the people involved have been living with the decision already made while the rest of the world still doesn't know. The quality of conversation, the silences, the small behavioral signals that experienced observers accumulate into a picture that is rarely as simple as the one being prepared for public release. What the staff at Buckingham Palace observed in the period between the engagement and the wedding was a young woman in the process of discovering what she had agreed to. This discovery was not clean or gradual. It arrived in pieces, some of them manageable and some of them not, and the people employed to support her watched it happen with the particular attention of professionals who understand that what they are witnessing will shape the nature of their work for years to come. Diana moved into Clarence House initially, staying with the Queen Mother, while the preparations for the wedding consumed the palace's considerable organizational capacity. The Queen Mother was charming to her. Everyone was charming to her. This was its own kind of problem, though it took Diana some time to understand it. Charm in a royal context is not the same as honesty. It is not the same as warmth. It is a performance of welcome that exists independently of whether welcome is actually felt, and it is performed so consistently and so skillfully by people who have spent their lives in proximity to the institution that distinguishing it from genuine feeling requires more experience than a 19-year-old recently arrived from a flat in Coleherne Court could reasonably be expected to possess. She was homesick almost immediately. This was observed and noted by the household staff at Clarence House, not in any official record, but in the way things are noted by people who see everything. She missed her flatmates. She missed the Coleherne Court life, with its ordinary rhythms and its freedom from scrutiny. She would sometimes stand at windows in a way that suggested she was looking for something the view could not provide. She telephoned her friends frequently, and the telephone conversations had a quality that staff who moved nearby could not entirely avoid registering, a brightness that worked too hard, a cheerfulness that was slightly out of key with itself. She was also, in those early weeks, already beginning to understand the shape of what she had entered. The palace is not an unkind place in any simple sense. It is a place of extraordinary formality and extraordinary comfort, operating simultaneously and often indistinguishably. There are people everywhere whose job is to ensure that every physical need is met before it is expressed. The temperature of rooms, the arrangement of flowers, the timing of meals, the preparation of clothing, the management of schedules, the anticipation of preferences, all of it is handled with a professionalism so complete that it can feel, from the inside, less like being cared for and more like being managed. The distinction matters. Being cared for implies a relationship. Being managed implies a system. Diana had arrived expecting the former and found herself inside the latter, and the difference was something she felt immediately and viscerally, even if she could not yet name it. The staff assigned to her in this period were experienced professionals. They had served other members of the royal family, and they brought to their work with Diana the practical competence and the emotional neutrality that palace service requires. They were not unkind. They were not warm in the way Diana was warm, which was immediately and totally and with her entire attention. They were professional, and professionalism, to a young woman whose emotional needs were as large and as specific as Diana's, read as distance, read as yet another form of not being chosen. She began to test the boundaries almost immediately. Not dramatically, not in ways that produced obvious incidents in those first weeks, but in the small, persistent ways of someone who needs to know where the walls are and how solid they are and what happens if you push against them. She would ask for things outside the established schedule and observe the response. She would express preferences that departed from the expected pattern and watch how they were handled. She would be warm and then suddenly cool, and register what the cooling produced in the people around her. This was not cynical. It is important to say that. It was not a calculated strategy. It was the behavior of someone who had learned in childhood that the emotional landscape around her was unreliable, and that the only way to navigate it safely was to map it constantly and keep the map updated. Diana had been doing this her entire life. She would do it for the rest of her life. It was one of the things that made her remarkable in public settings, where emotional mapping of a room was exactly the skill required, and it was one of the things that made her exhausted in private settings, where the people around her were not rooms to be read, but individuals with their own interior lives, who sometimes found the constant assessment uncomfortable. The formal training began. This is how it was understood inside the palace, as training, as the preparation of a young woman for a role that had specific requirements and a long and detailed history, and very little tolerance for improvisation. She was taught how to walk in formal settings, and how to stand for extended periods without the subtle physical adjustments that ordinary people make without thinking. She was taught the correct forms of address for the various categories of people she would encounter, and the social geography of formal occasions, which is more complex than it appears from the outside. She was taught how to receive people and how to conclude conversations without giving offense, and how to move through a crowded room in a way that suggested leisure while actually being entirely purposeful. She absorbed some of this readily. Her social instincts were good enough that certain aspects of formal behavior came naturally: the reading of individuals, the adjustment of her manner to suit the person in front of her, the deployment of her attention as a form of gift. These were things she already did, and the formal context gave them a structure she could work within. Other aspects were more difficult. The formality itself, the requirement to maintain a consistent public face regardless of what was happening internally, the understanding that her feelings, whatever they were not the primary concern of any room she entered in her official capacity. The institution did not ask how you were feeling, it asked whether you were ready. These were not the same question, and Diana was already discovering they were not. The staff observing this process noted things that they did not yet have a full framework for understanding. They saw a young woman who was trying very hard. This was genuine and visible, and not nothing. The trying was real. She wanted to do the thing correctly. She wanted in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime wanting to be chosen, to be good enough for this. She arrived at engagements prepared. She asked questions about protocol, with what appeared to be genuine desire to get it right. She was polite to everyone she encountered in those early weeks, with a consistency that senior staff found impressive, given what they knew about the adjustment period every new royal faced. But they also saw the strain underneath the trying. They saw it in the way she ate, or more precisely in the way she was beginning not to eat, which palace staff in close domestic contact notice before almost anyone else, because food in a household is their direct responsibility. They saw it in the quality of her sleep, observable in the way someone looks in the morning when they have not rested well. They saw it in the telephone calls, and in the window standing, and in the moments when she thought she was not being watched, and her face did something different from what it did when she knew she was. They also began to see, in those early months, the first appearances of something that would become much more familiar to them over the years ahead. The flash of a different Diana from the one that was being presented to the world. The Diana that was not trying hard and was not performing warmth and was not mapping the room with the polished social intelligence that everyone found so disarming. The Diana who was simply, underneath everything, frightened and angry and not entirely sure what she had gotten herself into. This Diana appeared in small moments. A comment delivered sharply to a member of staff who had done something slightly wrong and not yet had the chance to correct it. A request refused or questioned, producing a response that was out of proportion to the scale of the situation. A silence that had a temperature to it, that filled a room in a way that made the people in it aware they were in the presence of something they needed to navigate carefully. These moments were infrequent at first, infrequent enough that they could be explained away as stress, as the entirely understandable pressure of a young woman adjusting to an enormous life change. The more experienced staff made exactly this allowance. They had seen new royals adjust before. They knew that the adjustment period produced unusual behavior and that patience was professionally required. They extended that patience to Diana with the genuine goodwill that comes from understanding that no one steps into a role of this scale without considerable difficulty. What they could not have known in those early months was that these moments were not an adjustment period. They had a personality, not a simple personality and not an entirely unsympathetic one, but a personality shaped by specific experiences into specific patterns that the palace environment was going to intensify rather than smooth. The institution that Diana had entered was not designed to heal the wounds she carried. It was designed to perform continuity in the face of everything, including wounds, and performance, for someone whose wounds were as deep and as specific as Diana's, was the least useful thing the palace could offer. The relationship with Charles during the engagement period was, by most accounts that have emerged over the decades since, already troubled in ways that neither of them was fully equipped to address. Charles was a man of 40 and then some in emotional terms, formed by his own difficult relationship with intimacy and shaped by a palace childhood that had its own set of costs. He had been in love with Camilla Parker Bowles for years, in the complicated way of someone who understands that the love is real and the circumstances are impossible, and has found a way to live with both of those truths simultaneously. He was fond of Diana. He was not in love with her in the way that she needed him to be in love with her, which was absolutely and demonstrably, and without any reservation that could be read as anything other than complete commitment. This was understood by the household staff at some level from very early on. Not the specific facts of the situation, not the full picture that would eventually become public knowledge, but the emotional temperature of the relationship as it was visible in the spaces where staff were present. They saw how Charles and Diana occupied the same room. They saw how conversations between them moved and how they ended. They saw the adjustments that each person made in the presence of the other, and what those adjustments revealed about what was not being said. They were professionals, and they kept what they saw in the correct compartment. But they were also human, and they had eyes. One senior member of the household staff, someone who had served across several royal residences and who had the accumulated wisdom of decades in the profession, observed in this period something that she would articulate years later in the careful language of someone who has had a long time to choose their words. She said that Diana arrived at the palace looking for a home and found an institution, and that Charles arrived at the marriage looking for a suitable arrangement and found a person, and that neither of them had any tools for bridging the distance between what they had expected and what they had actually got. This was the situation as the wedding approached. The world is preparing itself for a fairy tale. The palace is preparing itself for a logistical operation of extraordinary complexity. The staff prepared themselves for the specific work of managing a household that contained two people who were already, before they had even stood at the altar, living in slightly different versions of what was happening to them. And Diana prepared herself in the way she had always prepared for the things that frightened her most. By performing certainty, by turning the brightness up to its highest setting, by doing what she had done since childhood when the ground felt unreliable, by making sure that everyone in the room was looking at her, so that at least the looking could be mistaken for the choosing she needed. The staff saw this too. They saw it and they said nothing, because saying things was not their role. Their role was to ensure the flowers were fresh and the schedules were kept, and the machinery of the household ran with the invisible efficiency that makes everything look effortless from the outside. But they saw it. They filed it away in that particular internal archive that palace staff develop over years of service, the archive that contains everything observed and nothing officially recorded, and all of it available to the experienced eye of anyone who knows how to ask the right questions in the right tone in a back corridor when the principals are otherwise engaged. They saw it from the beginning. That was what they would say later in those careful private conversations. They had seen it from the beginning. Not the full picture, not everything, but enough. Enough to know that the fairy tale was a performance, and that performances, however brilliant, however genuinely felt in the moment of their delivery, eventually encounter the audience of reality, and reality in that household, in those years, was not going to be kind. The wedding was 6 months away. 5. 4. The preparations accelerated with the momentum of something that had become too large to stop, even if stopping were possible, which by that point it was not. The dress was being made. The guest list was being managed. The security arrangements were being finalized. The street decorations were going up across London. And in the private rooms of the palace, in the corridors and the kitchens and the domestic spaces where the work of royal life actually happened, the staff were learning about Diana, learning her preferences and her patterns and her rhythms and her edges, learning where she was easy and where she was not, learning the particular emotional vocabulary of her moods and what each one required. They were teaching her the way you learn about a place you are going to live in for a long time, not romantically, not with judgment, with the practical attention of people who understand that accurate knowledge is the only reliable protection in an environment that does not forgive mistakes. They were learning about her, and what they were learning was complicated, and it was only the beginning. The 29th of July 1981 was a Wednesday, and London decided to treat it as something closer to a religious occasion than a civic one. The crowds had been gathering since the previous night, sleeping on pavements along the processional route with the particular British determination of people who have decided that discomfort is a reasonable price for a good position. By morning the city had the quality of a held breath, that specific urban stillness that precedes something enormous when the traffic has been redirected and the ordinary sounds of a working day have been suspended, and what remains is the sound of anticipation, which has its own frequency if you know how to listen for it. Inside Buckingham Palace the atmosphere was different. Not quieter exactly, but differently loud, the noise of an operation. The concentrated, purposeful sound of hundreds of people performing specific tasks with the precision that comes from months of rehearsal and the understanding that there is no version of this day that allows for error. Staff who had been working toward this morning for the better part of a year moved through corridors and rooms with the particular efficiency of people operating at the outer edge of their professional capacity. Not frantic, never frantic. That was not the palace way, but absolutely focused in a manner that excluded everything except the task immediately in front of them. Diana was in her room. The women assigned to her that morning had been selected with care. These were not junior members of staff. These were experienced professionals who had dressed women for significant occasions before and who understood that dressing a woman for the most watched wedding in television history was a task that required not only technical skill, but a specific kind of emotional intelligence. The ability to be present without being intrusive, to offer reassurance without making the offering too visible, to manage the physical reality of an extraordinarily complicated dress while simultaneously managing the atmosphere of the room containing the person who had to wear it. The dress itself was the work of David and Elizabeth Emanuel, and it was, by any technical assessment, an achievement. 25 feet of train, 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins, hand-embroidered lace, ivory taffeta with antique lace flounces. It was designed to be seen from a distance, to read as spectacle, to photograph as something from a story that predated photography. It was, in the specific language of royal weddings, correct. It said the right things, it announced the right things. It transformed the young woman inside it into the visual grammar of a princess, which was precisely what it was designed to do. What it was not designed to account for was the young woman inside it. The women dressing Diana that morning saw things that the cameras outside would not see, and that the 750 million people watching on television would not see, and that the historical record would take decades to begin assembling from fragments. They saw a young woman who had been crying, not that morning specifically, or not only that morning, but recently enough that the evidence required careful management before she could be presented to the world. They saw a young woman whose hands were not entirely steady. They saw someone going through the motions of preparation with a surface brightness that was genuine in the way that all performances are genuine when the performer has fully committed to them, and that was also, underneath, doing something more complicated. One of the senior dressers who worked on Diana in those years described later, in the careful retrospective language of someone who has chosen their disclosures thoughtfully, that Diana on her wedding morning had the quality of someone who had made a decision they knew was the wrong one and had decided to make it anyway. Not because they were stupid, not because they didn't know, but because stopping was no longer a thing that existed as an option and forward was the only direction available. Diana herself confirmed something close to this in later accounts. She described having doubts. She described conversations with her sisters in which she expressed those doubts and was told, in the sisterly way of people who love you but are also standing in the path of something too large to redirect, that it was too late to stop now. The dress was made. The crowd was assembled. The carriages were waiting. The world was watching. It was too late to stop. So she went. The ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral was, by every external measure, magnificent. The building held 3,500 guests, and the weight of an ancient institution's understanding of itself. The music was extraordinary. The vows were spoken correctly. The dress moved through the cathedral like something from a collective dream that a nation had been having for months, and had now been given physical form. Diana's voice was steady when it needed to be steady, and her face was the face of a princess when it needed to be the face of a princess. She mispronounced Charles's name in the vows. Philip Charles Arthur George became Charles Philip Arthur George in her mouth, and the watching world found it charming, endearing. Evidence of her human vulnerability in a moment of overwhelming pressure. What only the people very close to her knew was that she had been mispronouncing it during rehearsals as well, not from nerves, but from a mind that was partially elsewhere even during practice. The mind that was partially elsewhere was doing what it had always done under pressure. It was assessing, reading, trying to understand the situation it was inside, and whether the situation was safe. The balcony kiss, the carriage, the crowds, the flowers thrown from above, the noise of a city expressing something that was partly genuine joy, and partly the relief of a narrative completed, the fairy tale delivered on schedule. Diana stood on the balcony and received it all, the noise and the flowers and the love of strangers, and she smiled in a way that was completely real and completely performed, and both of those things simultaneously, in the way that only someone of considerable natural gifts can manage. The staff, watching from their correct positions, observed all of this with the professional attention of people who are responsible for ensuring it goes correctly. It went correctly. From the outside it went correctly. From the inside, certain things had already begun that the correctness of the outside did not address. The honeymoon was on the royal yacht Britannia, initially, sailing through the Mediterranean. Before that, there were a few days at Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate in Hampshire, which had been used for royal honeymoons before, and which offered the specific quality of privacy that comes from a large house with sufficient staff to maintain comfort while being positioned far enough from London that the immediate pressure of the public eye was somewhat reduced. Somewhat, because the press did not fully retreat. The photographers found positions. The telephoto lenses were in use. The honeymoon of the most famous couple in the world was going to be documented, whether or not the couple inside it consented to the documentation. And this was a reality that Diana was encountering for the first time in its full form. She had understood intellectually that her life was going to be observed. She had not fully understood what it felt like to be observed constantly and specifically, and with the appetite of an audience that had invested emotionally in the narrative of your happiness, and therefore required ongoing evidence of it. In Britannia, the household was a naval one. The crew of the royal yacht were experienced in the specific requirements of royal travel, and they brought to their work the qualities of naval discipline, efficiency, discretion, a hierarchy of command so thoroughly internalized that it operated without visible management. They were, in terms of palace service, excellent staff. They were also, for Diana, another unfamiliar environment with another set of rules she had not been taught, and another group of people who were present but not available in the way that she needed people to be available. The accounts that have emerged over decades from those who were present on Britannia during the honeymoon suggest a picture that is considerably more complicated than the public imagery of the time. Charles read. He was a committed reader with specific intellectual interests, and the honeymoon was not, for him, a reason to abandon the reading habit.
He brought books, he read them, he wrote in his journal.
He did the things that a man of his particular formation did in a private space, which were not necessarily the things that a 20-year-old bride who had married him 7 days ago needed him to be doing. Diana needed attention. This is not a criticism stated as a fact, it is a fact stated as a fact. She needed the focused and specific and unconditional attention of the person she had married, in the way that a person who has been formed by the specific wound of abandonment always needs it from the people they have chosen to be closest to. Charles's reading was not an act of aggression. It was not a deliberate withdrawal. It was simply who he was. But who he was and what Diana needed were in those early days already beginning to define a gap that neither of them had the tools or the language to bridge. Staff on Britannia observed this gap in the practical ways that staff observe things. They saw how meals went. They saw how evenings were spent. They saw the quality of interaction between the couple in the spaces where they were present. They carried things and arranged things and maintained the physical environment with impeccable professionalism, and they saw, with the eyes that cannot be closed, that the honeymoon had a particular quality of two people discovering each other's reality and finding the discovery more complicated than the expectation. Diana was also, during this period, beginning to show signs of the eating difficulties that would define a significant portion of her later life. The bulimia that she would eventually describe publicly had its roots, by her own account, in the period around the engagement and early marriage. The stress of the transition, the loss of control over her environment, the gap between what she had hoped for and what she was experiencing, all of it expressed itself through the oldest and most personal control available to her. What went into her body and what did not. Staff who manage food in royal settings are in an unusually intimate relationship with the eating habits of their principals. They prepare the food, they serve it, they clear it away, they notice what has been eaten and what has not, with the accuracy of people for whom this information is professionally relevant. On Britannia, and in the households that followed, what the food staff noticed about Diana was noted and quietly filed alongside everything else they were observing and not yet saying. They returned to London. The real marriage began, which is always different from the honeymoon marriage, which is itself different from the engagement. The real marriage is the daily one, the one that happens in ordinary time with ordinary demands and without the elevated romantic framework of a ceremony and a yacht. The one where two people find out what they have actually signed up for, and the finding is done in the company of the staff who are present for the ordinary time and who see everything the ordinary time contains. The household at Highgrove, the country house in Gloucestershire that was Charles's home and now Diana's, was organised around Charles's preferences and Charles's rhythms and Charles's long-established way of doing things, which was itself organised around a very particular understanding of country life, of gardening and architecture, and the specific rituals of the English countryside that Charles found genuinely restorative and Diana found genuinely alienating. Highgrove was not her house in any sense. It was his house into which she had moved, and the staff there were his staff, formed by years of service to his preferences, oriented toward his comfort in ways that were not immediately transferable to the young woman who had arrived alongside him. The Highgrove staff observed Diana in those first months with the cautious professional attention of people who understand they are seeing the beginning of something whose full shape is not yet apparent. They noted that she was often unhappy in the country, that she found the isolation of rural Gloucestershire, after the London life she had been living, something close to suffocating, that she missed people and noise and the particular energy of a city in a way that expressed itself through a restlessness that the house and grounds could not absorb. They noted that she could be, in those months, either intensely warm or sharply difficult, with very little visible transition between the two states. A morning that began with genuine brightness, with laughter in the kitchen, and genuine interest in the staff as individuals, could arrive in the afternoon in a very different register. Something would shift. Sometimes it was traceable to a telephone call, sometimes to a mood that arrived without visible external cause. And the shift would be felt by everyone in the household, because Diana's emotional states were not private in the way that more contained personalities keep their states private.
They filled the available space. They changed the temperature of the rooms.
This was noted without judgment by the experienced members of the household. Adjustment, they told each other. The girl is adjusting. This is what adjustment looks like from the inside. They had seen adjustment before. They knew it produced unusual behavior. They maintained the patience and the professionalism that adjustment required. What they could not have known in those first months was what the more experienced members of the household would eventually come to understand with the clarity of people who have watched something long enough to see its full pattern. This was not only adjustment, the adjustment was real, and the allowance for it was correct. But underneath the adjustment was something structural, something that had been there before the marriage and before the palace and before the engagement, something that the palace environment was not going to resolve, but was instead going to intensify in ways that would test everyone inside it. The survival rules began to form, not written down, never written down, passed in the way of palace knowledge, through observation and quiet conversation, and the accumulated wisdom of people who have worked out through direct experience what is required to function in a specific environment. Do not approach her if she has been on the telephone and the call has not gone well. Learn to read the post-telephone quality of the silence and give it space before moving into it with any request or requirement. Do not comment on what she has or has not eaten. The subject is present in the room in a way that everyone can feel and nobody addresses directly, and the addressing of it directly produces outcomes that are not manageable. Do not mistake warmth for permanence. The warmth is real. It is also not a guarantee of how the next hour will feel. Receive it when it comes, and do not build your expectations of the next hour upon it. Do not let her see that you have noticed something she does not want noticed. She notices everything, but she does not want her noticing acknowledged when the thing being noticed is something she is not ready to name. Do not be the person nearest to her when the mood shifts if there is any way to avoid it. If you cannot avoid it, be professional. If the professionalism produces a sharp response, absorb it without reaction. Reaction gives the sharpness somewhere to go, and somewhere to go means it will go further. These rules were not cruelty in the articulation. They were practical intelligence. They were the accumulated wisdom of people trying to do their jobs in a complex environment with dignity and efficiency. They were also, if you held them up to a different light, a portrait of what it was like to work for Diana in those early years, a portrait that the public, watching the fairy tale unfold in photographs and official appearances, had no access to and no reason to suspect. The fairy tale continued on the outside. The photographs were released. The appearances were made. Diana, in public, was everything the public needed her to be and more. She had a gift for public occasions that was, in those early years, still fresh enough to look effortless even when it was not. She could walk into a room of strangers and within minutes have produced in them the feeling that she had come specifically to see them and was genuinely glad she had. She could touch people in the way the palace generally avoided touch, and the people she touched would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. The press was infatuated. The public was infatuated. Charles, standing beside her at various functions, was visibly less central to the proceedings than his wife, which produced in him a response that was understandable and not entirely gracious, and which the staff observed in the small tells of a man whose self-conception is encountering friction. And in the private rooms, in the hours after the public occasions, in the ordinary daily time of the marriage, the other things were happening, the things the cameras did not reach, the difficult mornings, the shifted moods, the sharp edges of a personality under enormous pressure expressing itself in the directions available to it. The gradual, consistent education of the household staff in the specific requirements of serving a woman who was not what she appeared to be, which is not to say she was false, she was not false, she was multiple, which is a very different thing and in some ways a more demanding one. The staff learned. They were professionals, and learning was part of the job. They learned Diana with the thoroughness that the work required. They learned her completely enough that the learning itself became a kind of knowledge that went beyond professional utility. They knew her in the specific and intimate and entirely non-reciprocal way that staff know their principles. They knew her in the way you know a place you have spent years inside. Not as an abstraction, not as a public image, not as a fairy tale, but as a daily reality with a specific texture and a specific temperature and specific things that were wonderful about it and specific things that were not. They knew her from the beginning. And from the beginning they knew that the story was more complicated than the one being told outside. That was what the staff knew, and it was only still the beginning. There is a particular kind of professional exhaustion that has no clean name in ordinary language. It is not physical tiredness, though it contains physical tiredness. It is not emotional burnout in the clinical sense, though it contains that too. It is the specific fatigue that comes from living alongside a reality that is in constant and irreconcilable conflict with the official version of that reality. From knowing one thing completely and being required by the terms of your employment and your professional dignity and the legal weight of your discretion agreement to behave as though you know something else entirely. The staff at Kensington Palace and Highgrove, in the middle years of the Wales marriage, knew this fatigue intimately. They lived inside it daily. They were the custodians of two simultaneous truths about the same woman, and the distance between those truths was not small and was not narrowing, and was in fact growing wider with each year that passed and each public appearance that confirmed for the watching world a version of Diana that the household recognized only partially. Diana was, by the mid-1980s, one of the most famous human beings on the planet. This is not hyperbole. The reach of her image, the frequency of her appearance in the global media, the intensity of the attention directed at her from every country with a camera and a printing press, had reached a scale that had no real precedent. She was on magazine covers with a regularity that suggested the magazines would cease to exist without her. She was photographed thousands of times a year. She was written about in volumes that could fill libraries. She was the subject of a collective projection so enormous and so varied that the real woman underneath it had become, in a sense, irrelevant to the phenomenon bearing her name. The public Diana was warm. Radically, demonstrably, specifically warm, in ways that the palace had never quite produced before and has not quite produced since. She touched people. She sat on floors beside sick children in hospital wards and held their hands and looked at them with her full attention in a way that communicated, without language, that they were the only people in the world at that moment. She shook hands with AIDS patients in 1987 without gloves, at a time when the public understanding of HIV transmission was still saturated with fear and prejudice, and the gesture landed with the force of a cultural event, because it was a cultural event. She walked through landmine fields in Angola in 1997 wearing a visor and a flak jacket, and the photographs of her doing so changed international policy in ways that the professional diplomats who had been working on the issue for years could not quite match. She was, in public, transcendent. This is the word that kept appearing in the accounts of people who encountered her in those settings. Not merely impressive, not merely skilled, transcendent. The sense of being in the presence of someone who was operating at a frequency slightly above the ordinary, who had access to something the room did not have access to until she arrived and opened the valve. This was real. It requires saying clearly because the other things that require saying are also real, and the temptation when assembling a complicated portrait is to allow the complications to cancel out the genuine qualities. Diana's public gifts were not manufactured. They were not PR strategies expressed through a gifted performer, though they were also sometimes that. They were rooted in something authentic, in a genuine capacity for empathy that had been developed through the specific suffering of her own history, and that expressed itself in public contexts with a naturalness that no amount of coaching could have produced in someone who did not already possess the underlying capacity. The staff knew this. They had seen her public gifts at close range, and they were not dismissive of them. They were witnesses to her genuine moments, in the same way they were witnesses to everything else, with accuracy and without embellishment. They knew the gifts were real. They also knew what the cameras did not reach. The private Diana was not a monster. It is important to establish this with the same clarity with which it was established that the public Diana was not a fabrication. She was not a monster. She was a person with specific wounds and specific needs and specific patterns of behavior that those wounds and needs had produced, and those patterns were not always the patterns of someone who was easy to be around or kind to be around or safe to be around in the specific sense of knowing what you were going to get when you walked into the room. She could be, in private, extraordinarily kind. The same attentiveness that made her remarkable in hospital wards operated in smaller domestic spaces too. She remembered things. A staff member's child's name, mentioned once in passing, would be recalled months later with a specificity that felt like genuine interest, and often was. She could sit in a kitchen at an unexpected hour and talk to a junior cook with the directness and the lack of condescension of someone who had decided that this person was worth her full attention, and the cook would leave that conversation feeling seen in a way that was not entirely explained by the novelty of a princess in the kitchen at midnight. She gave gifts impulsively, and sometimes with a thoughtfulness that suggested she had been paying more attention than anyone realized. She could be funny, with the quick observational humor that required real intelligence and real social awareness to produce, and the humor at its best was generous, directed outward at absurdities and situations rather than at people. She could be playful in a way that was contagious, that lifted the atmosphere of a room without effort, that made even the most experienced and professionally neutral staff members find themselves smiling despite the professional neutrality. These things were true. The staff who served her in those years would affirm them without hesitation. And then there were the other things. The other things did not arrive on a schedule. This was their primary characteristic and the source of their primary power. If they had arrived on a schedule, they could have been prepared for. If they had been consistently present, they could have been professionally accommodated in the way that palace staff accommodated all kinds of difficult behavior, with competence and distance, and the particular internal armoring of people who have learned not to take things personally. But they did not arrive on a schedule, and they were not consistently present, and the unpredictability was itself a form of pressure that the household lived under constantly. A morning that began well could turn without visible cause. Something internal shifted in Diana, and the shift expressed itself outward with an immediacy that did not allow for preparation, because there was nothing to prepare for. The morning had been fine. The morning was not fine. The person who had been charming at breakfast was someone different by mid-morning, and the staff who moved through the household in the space between those two versions were required to adjust without being given any information about what had changed or why. The adjustment required was not simple. Diana's difficult moods were not the difficult moods of someone who wanted to be left alone or who withdrew into silence that could be worked around. They were the difficult moods of someone who became more present, not less, when she was unhappy, more demanding of attention, more watchful of the people around her, more likely to find fault with things that would not have warranted attention on a better day, and to find it in a way that was specific enough to feel personal, even when it was almost certainly not. A footman carrying a tray incorrectly would be corrected, not in the brief professional way of a household manager identifying an error, in a way that was personal, that found the person inside the professional and addressed itself to them, that carried a tone underneath the words that said, "You have failed me specifically," not "You have done this task incorrectly," a significant and important distinction that the footman in question would feel the difference between, even if he could not have immediately articulated what the difference was. A lady in waiting who offered an opinion that had not been solicited might find that her presence was suddenly felt as an intrusion. Diana could make someone feel unwelcome in a room without saying anything directly addressable. She could produce through the quality of her attention, or the withdrawal of it, a subtle but unmistakable signal that you had become, in this moment, someone whose presence she found unnecessary. The signal was delivered without cruelty in the sense of open hostility. It was delivered with something colder than cruelty, with an indifference that was pointed enough to be felt as its opposite. A member of staff who had done something correctly, but who happened to be nearby when Diana was processing something difficult, might be on the receiving end of a comment that had no relationship to anything they had actually done, a remark about their manner, their speed, the way they had arranged something that had in fact been arranged correctly. The remark would be delivered quietly, without anger in the obvious sense, with the particular quality that several staff members would independently describe over the years as the thing that was harder to absorb than shouting, because shouting acknowledges that you exist as someone worth shouting at. The quiet version said something more complicated. It said you are an instrument through which I am currently expressing something, and your actual qualities as a person are not relevant to this exchange. There were incidents, not daily, not even weekly, in the sense of significant incidents, but with a frequency and a consistency that meant the staff who served her over extended periods could speak about them not as isolated events, but as a pattern. The pattern was what distinguished the difficult days from simply having a bad moment in a stressful life, which everyone has and which no one should be judged by. The pattern was the thing that the staff saw clearly and the public never saw at all, and that the historical record took decades to begin assembling from the fragments that careful and mostly anonymous sources eventually provided. One of the most consistent elements of the pattern was what happened with information. Diana had an extraordinary appetite for information about the people around her. Not abstract information, personal information, the state of their relationships, the difficulties in their families, the private anxieties that they carried into work and tried to leave at the door. She gathered this information through conversation, through the directness and warmth that made people feel safe enough to share things they had not planned to share, and through observation, which she conducted with the accuracy of someone who had been reading emotional rooms since early childhood. The gathering itself was not sinister. People who felt genuinely seen by her shared genuinely, and her interest in those moments was real. The problem was what happened with the information once it had been gathered. It did not stay in the place it had been received, in the warm context of a human exchange between two people who were for a moment being direct with each other. It became available, not deployed in any calculated way that could be clearly identified as such, but available, present in the room in subsequent interactions in ways that the person who had shared it could sometimes feel without being able to name. A staff member who had mentioned a difficulty in her marriage in a moment of unexpected intimacy with Diana might find, weeks later when relations between them had cooled for unrelated reasons, that Diana's manner toward her had a quality that felt like it was informed by that earlier disclosure. Nothing said directly, nothing that could be addressed, just a quality. A slight tonal shift in how Diana spoke to her suggested that she had not forgotten what she knew, and that the knowledge was still there, available, in the architecture of their interactions. This made people careful, carefully careful. The kind of care that produces a specific kind of exhaustion because it cannot be dropped at the end of the working day in the way that ordinary professional caution can be dropped. It comes home with you. It changes how you sleep. The relationship with the media in those years was another dimension of the private Diana that the public version obscured. The public Diana was presented and often experienced herself as a victim of press intrusion, a woman whose privacy was being systematically violated by an industry that had decided her image was too commercially valuable to leave alone. This was true, the press intrusion was real, and its effects on her daily life were genuinely damaging, and the lack of legal and institutional protection available to her was a genuine injustice that has only partially been addressed in the years since, and simultaneously Diana was one of the most skilled media operators of her era. This was also true, and the two truths existed together in a way that the public version of her story rarely accommodated. She understood the press with the specific intelligence of someone who has studied a system carefully enough to know how to work it. She knew which photographers would treat her well, and which ones she could not trust. She knew which editors were sympathetic and which were hostile, and what each of them needed from her to produce coverage that served her purposes. She knew how to position herself for a photograph without appearing to position herself. She knew how to ensure that certain images were taken and certain others were not, and she managed this with a lightness of touch that left almost no visible fingerprints. She cultivated relationships with specific journalists. These relationships were not friendships in the conventional sense, though they sometimes had the warmth of friendships. They were working relationships conducted with considerable sophistication on both sides,
in which Diana provided access and information, and the journalist provided coverage that Diana found useful. The information she provided was not always false. It was selected, curated, shaped to serve the narrative she was building about herself and about her marriage and about the institution in which she was trapped and against which she was, from relatively early on, conducting a war that the public did not fully understand was a war.
The staff saw this operation from the inside. They saw the telephone calls with journalists. They saw the meetings with sympathetic members of the press that were arranged with the careful discretion of things that were not supposed to be noticed but were. They saw the preparation that went into apparently spontaneous moments. The walk past the school gates that happened to coincide with a photographer's presence, the arrival at a hospital that was not on the official schedule, but that produced photographs that served a specific purpose in the ongoing management of Diana's public image. They saw it and they said nothing. Saying nothing was the job, but the seeing accumulated. The knowledge of the gap between the presented version and the operational reality accumulated, and it added another layer to the complicated picture that the staff were assembling from their daily proximity to a woman who was, simultaneously, everything the public believed her to be, and something considerably more complex. There was a specific incident that several members of the household staff from those years have described independently, with variations in detail that suggest genuine memory rather than coordinated account, that illuminates the private Diana with particular clarity. It involves a junior member of staff, a young woman in her early 20s who had been working in the household for less than a year and who had not yet accumulated sufficient experience to have fully mapped the landscape she was operating in. This young woman had made a small error, the kind of error that in most professional environments would be noted, corrected, and moved past without lasting consequence. She had mishandled a scheduling matter, a communication that had gone to the wrong person at the wrong time, producing a minor but visible confusion in the arrangements for a public engagement. The confusion was resolved. The engagement proceeded correctly. The error was, in any objective assessment, minor. Diana addressed it. She did not address it in the way that a manager addresses an error, with specificity and professionalism and the orientation toward correction that makes errors useful rather than simply punitive. She addressed it in a way that the young woman in question would describe, years later, as the moment she understood what the job actually involved. Diana sat her down. She spoke quietly, which the young woman had not yet learned to identify as the register requiring the most attention. She described the error in considerable detail, more detail than the error warranted, in a way that made it larger in the young woman's perception than it had actually been. Then she said something that the young woman remembered precisely for years afterward. She said, "I need people around me who understand what is at stake." What is at stake? The phrase landed with a weight that went well beyond the scheduling error and addressed itself to something larger, to the young woman's fundamental fitness for the proximity she occupied, to the question of whether she was the kind of person whose presence in that household was a contribution or a liability. It was a question with only one possible answer in the context in which it had been raised, and the answer made the young woman feel approximately 3 inches tall. Diana then smiled. This was the part the young woman found most difficult to process afterward. The smile was warm, genuine in its way. It said, "We understand each other now, and that understanding is a good thing." It moved the interaction from the place of severity to the place of resolution with a speed that was disorienting. The young woman left the room not entirely sure what had happened, only that something had happened that she needed to ensure did not happen again. This pattern, the sharp and precise delivery followed by the warm resolution that made the sharpness harder rather than easier to process, appeared in the accounts of multiple staff members from those years. It was not accidental. It was not unconscious in any simple sense. It was the behavior of someone who understood power and its instruments with considerable sophistication, and who used that understanding in the spaces where power was available to be used. The spaces where it was available were primarily the domestic ones, the household, the staff, the people whose professional obligations required them to receive what Diana expressed without the option of equivalent expression in return. This asymmetry was the structural condition of palace service, and Diana operated within it as all her predecessors had operated within it, with the difference that she did so while simultaneously presenting herself to the world as someone uniquely sensitized to the experience of powerlessness. The staff held this contradiction with the professional competence they brought to everything. They held the public Diana and the private Diana in the same internal space, and they managed the distance between them with discretion and with the weariness that comes from sustained double consciousness. They went home. They did not speak about what they had seen, not in any traceable way, not in any way that risked the careers and the confidentiality agreements and the professional reputations that palace service represented, but among themselves, in the back corridors and the kitchens and the quiet conversations of people who share an unusual experience, they spoke, carefully, in the language of euphemism and professional understatement that palace culture requires even in its unofficial registers. She could be difficult, they said. They said she could be very difficult. They said she could make a person feel that their presence in the room was an imposition even when the presence had been requested. They said she had a gift for finding the exact thing that would land, and landing it precisely, and then moving on as if nothing had been thrown. And sometimes, in the more honest registers, when the professional understatement had been exhausted by a particularly instructive day, someone would say it more directly. Someone who had been in the room when Diana's other face had appeared would set down whatever they were carrying and use the phrase that the Margaret script had used and that palace staff reach for across generations when the euphemisms run out. A nasty piece of work, they would say, and the others in the room would understand exactly what was meant. Not the whole of her, not even the majority of her, but a part of her that was real and that they had encountered, and that the world currently weeping over her photographs in magazines would not have recognized and would not have believed. The two Dianas existed simultaneously. The staff carried both, and the carrying cost something that nobody in the official version of the story accounted for, because official versions of stories rarely do. There is a specific geography to a failing marriage inside a large house. It is not simply emotional, it is physical. It expresses itself in the arrangement of rooms and the timing of movements and the routes that two people take through shared space when the sharing has become something to be managed rather than something that is simply happening. Staff who work in large private households develop an acute sensitivity to this geography because the geography is their working environment and its changes affect the nature of their work in ways that are immediate and practical and not always comfortable. By the mid-1980s, the geography of the Wales marriage had developed a shape that the staff at Kensington Palace and Highgrove could read with the accuracy of people who have been living inside it long enough to know its every contour. Charles's movements through the household and Diana's movements through the household had become largely separate itineraries that occasionally intersected in the spaces designated for intersection: the formal dining room, the public engagements, the official appearances that required them to occupy the same frame, and did not otherwise overlap in the ways that suggest two people who are choosing each other's company. This was visible to everyone inside the household. It was invisible to almost everyone outside it. The management of that gap between visible and invisible was one of the central tasks of the palace staff in those years, and it was a task that required considerable professional skill and produced considerable professional exhaustion because the gap was not stable. It was growing, and things that grow in the wrong direction tend to require more management the larger they become, until they reach a size at which management is no longer the operative concept, and something more definitive is required. The mornings told the story most clearly. In households where marriages are functioning, mornings have a shared quality, even if the sharing is minimal and practical. The awareness of another person in space. The small domestic adjustments that people make for each other without thinking. The cup was brought without being asked for. The information passed between two people who are living in the same current even when they are not speaking. In the Wales household by the middle of the decade, mornings were not shared in any of these ways. Charles had his morning and Diana had hers, and the staff navigated between them with the careful choreography of people who have learned exactly how far apart two weather systems need to be kept to prevent collision. His schedule was his schedule. Hers was hers. They were managed by different members of staff, coordinated by people whose professional skill included the ability to produce the appearance of a unified household from the reality of two separate operations running under the same roof. The telephones were a constant. Both of them used telephones with a frequency and an intensity that the staff around them could not entirely avoid registering. Charles's calls had their own character, their own particular quality of extended private conversation that staff who moved nearby learned to identify and give space to. Diana's calls had a different character, more varied, sometimes warm and conspiratorial, the tone of a woman talking to someone who was on her side, sometimes distressed in a way that expressed itself physically, through the body language visible when a door was not fully closed, through the aftermath quality of the silence when the call ended. The staff did not listen. This requires saying clearly because the accusation of listening has been leveled at palace staff often enough to require address. They did not listen in the sense of applying their attention deliberately to private conversations. They were present in the way that staff are always present in large houses, moving through the spaces of the house in the course of their work, and sound in large houses does not always respect the boundaries that the people inside them would prefer. What the staff heard, they heard incidentally. What they observed, because observation was inseparable from their presence. And what they incidentally heard, and inevitably observed, accumulated over months and years into a picture that was clear to anyone inside it, even without the specific content of any individual conversation. The picture was this. Two people who had begun with insufficient foundation were discovering that the foundation was not growing under the weight of the marriage, but was instead eroding. Charles had Camilla. This was known inside the household at some level from relatively early in the marriage, known in the way that things are known when they are present in a house without being named, felt in the spaces between what is said and what is not said, in the patterns of absence and presence that two people in proximity to the principles can map even without the explicit information that would make the map officially readable. Diana knew. Her knowing was not a gradual discovery. It was an early and devastating understanding that the man she had married was emotionally located somewhere else, and that the somewhere else had a name and a face and a history that predated Diana's own presence in his life. What she did with this knowledge in those years was not simple and not consistent. She confronted it directly on some occasions with a fury that the household could hear through doors. She performed around it on others with a professional smoothness that was itself a form of confrontation. She suffered because of it in ways that expressed themselves through the body, through the eating and the crying and the physical symptoms of a distress that had nowhere adequate to go. The staff saw all of this. They saw Charles's absences and what the absences meant and what Diana's face did in the aftermath of each one. They saw Diana's distress and they were not unmoved by it, because they were human beings, and the distress was real and visible, and often directed in their direction, not as aggression, but as the spillover of a contained pressure that the container could not always hold, because that was the complication. Diana's suffering was genuine, and the staff's awareness of it was genuine, and their sympathy was genuine, and none of that cancelled out the fact that the suffering expressed itself in ways that were not always easy to be the recipient of. The two things were true simultaneously, and the staff lived inside both of them every day without the luxury of choosing which one to respond to. She was harder to work for in those years than she had been in the early period. This is the assessment that emerges from the accounts of those who served her across an extended arc. Not harder at every moment, not harder every day, but harder in the aggregate, in the accumulated weight of sustained proximity to someone whose internal weather was severe, and whose habit of distributing that weather outward into the household had not softened with time but had in some respects intensified. The demands increased, not in any dramatic single escalation that could be identified as a turning point. In the gradual accumulation of small escalations, that is how demands increase in institutional environments, where direct challenge is professionally impossible. The expectations around timing became more precise, and the consequences of failing to meet them became more pronounced. The preferences around domestic arrangements became more specific, and the significance attached to departures from those specifications became larger. The threshold for what constituted an error became lower, and the weight attached to errors when they occurred became heavier. A footman who had been in the household for 3 years and who knew the rhythms and the requirements with the thoroughness of extended experience found himself in this period making errors he had not made in his earlier years of service. Not because his competence had declined, because the environment had changed in ways that made competence insufficient. The standard was moving, the target was relocating, and the relocation was not communicated through instruction, because instruction would have required acknowledging that the standard had changed, which would have required acknowledging why it had changed, which was not a conversation that was going to happen. He absorbed the corrections with the professional neutrality that his training required, and he discussed them with no one in any official capacity, and he discussed them in the kitchen after long shifts with the specificity and the controlled frustration of someone who needs to speak the truth to someone who will understand it and has only a narrow window in which the speaking is safe. The dynamic between Charles and Diana in those years produced a particular kind of pressure on the staff that went beyond the ordinary demands of serving two principals with different preferences and different schedules. It produced the pressure of being required to serve two people who were at war with each other without being able to acknowledge that the war existed. The war was conducted in the specific register of people who have access to every form of weaponry except direct confrontation, and who therefore use everything else. Atmospheres, timings, the strategic placement of presence and absence, the selection of which engagements to attend and which to find reasons to avoid, the careful management of what was said to whom, about what, which was also the management of what the world understood about the marriage and who was responsible for its condition. The staff were inside this war in the way that domestic staff are always inside domestic conflicts. They were the environment in which the war was being conducted. The household was the battlefield, and they were the geography of it, and geography does not get to have opinions about the battles it contains. They served both principles with the professional even-handedness that the role required. They said nothing. They maintained the appearances that needed to be maintained. They produced the functioning household that was their professional obligation, regardless of what the household contained. But they felt it. The long-term staff, the ones who had been present from the early years and who would remain present as the marriage deteriorated further and eventually ended, felt it in ways that were cumulative and not always adequately processed, because adequate processing was not something that palace service made available. "You are absorbed," you continued. You came back the next morning and were absorbed again. The children changed the dynamic in the way that children always change the dynamic of a troubled marriage, by adding a layer of genuine love and genuine complexity that could not be entirely subsumed into the conflict around it. William was born in 1982, Harry in 1984, and their arrival introduced into the household a dimension that was separate from the marriage, and more straightforwardly affectionate than almost anything else in the house during those years. Diana with her children was, by the unanimous account of the nursery staff who worked most closely with them, something different from Diana in other contexts. She was present in a way that was total rather than partial. She was warm without the heat that sometimes made her warmth a demanding thing to receive. She was playful with a genuine delight that the children reflected back and that produced in the household spaces where they spent time together a quality that was lighter and simpler and more straightforwardly good than most of what the house contained. She also insisted on being a different kind of royal mother than had been traditional. She wanted the children to have experiences of the ordinary world. She took them to McDonald's and theme parks and swimming pools with the deliberate intention of giving them contact with lives that were not organized around ceremony and precedence and the management of public appearance. She was physical with them in a way that was notable in the context of royal parenting, as it had historically been practiced. She hugged them. She roughhoused with them. She sat on the floor with them. She was in the nursery and in the informal domestic spaces she created for them. Someone who had decided that her children would not have the childhood she had had, and the decision was made with a ferocity of commitment that the nursery staff witnessed daily, and that was among the most uncomplicated things they observed about her. The complexity arrived at the border between her mothering and everything else. She could be in the nursery with William and Harry at 3 in the afternoon, entirely present, entirely warm, entirely the mother she had decided to be. And by 5 o'clock, when the children were with their nannies, and the transition back into the adult household had occurred, be in a completely different register. The warmth did not carry across the border. The border was real, and the people on the other side of it were staff, not children, and did not receive the version of Diana that the nursery contained. Charles with the children was more complicated. He loved them, clearly and genuinely, but his love expressed itself in ways that were formed by his own experience of being parented, which meant that it was sometimes distant in ways it did not intend to be, and formal in ways that the children felt even when they could not name it. He was better with them as they grew older and could engage with his specific intellectual interests. He was less naturally comfortable with the physical immediacy of small children in ways that Diana found difficult not to interpret as emotional withdrawal, even when it was simply a temperamental difference. The staff observed the parenting of both principals with the careful attention of people who understood that the children's welfare was a legitimate professional concern, and also with the human concern of people who liked the children and who in some cases formed attachments to them that were among the most straightforwardly affectionate relationships in that household during those years. They also observed what the parenting conflict between Charles and Diana looked like from the inside, which was different from what it looked like in the press, which was different again from what it looked like in the official accounts. The disagreements about the children's upbringing were real. The use of the children as emotional leverage in the broader conflict of the marriage was also real, and the staff saw it operating in the small daily ways, that it operated without the dramatic visible confrontations that the press imagined. Diana used the children as proof of her fitness, her commitment, her superiority as a parent, her greater suitability as the more emotionally present and more genuinely loving of the two. She did not do this consciously as a strategic operation. She did it as someone who is fighting for position in a war she has identified as existential and who uses the strongest available evidence. The strongest available evidence was her relationship with her children, and she deployed it with the instinct of someone who knows where her advantages lie. The staff saw this deployment. They saw it in the way she managed information about the children's lives, in the way she positioned herself in relation to their needs, in contexts where that positioning would be observed by the right people. They saw it without judgment in most cases because they understood the context that produced it, and because Diana's love for her children was real, regardless of the uses to which it was also put. Outside the house, the marriage was still being managed for public consumption. The joint appearances continued, the photographs were taken, the smiles were produced with the professional consistency of people who have been doing something difficult for long enough that the difficulty no longer shows on the surface. Charles and Diana at official engagements in those middle years were, to the watching public, a couple who might be strained, who might be experiencing the ordinary pressures of public life and of two strong personalities sharing a space, but who were fundamentally there, together. The monarchy is intact. The fairy tale continues on its designated trajectory. The staff who accompanied them to these engagements knew what preceded them and what followed them, and what happened in the spaces between the camera's presence and its absence. They saw the preparation required to produce the public version. They saw Diana building herself into the woman who would walk through those doors, assembling the brightness and the warmth and the public face with the deliberateness of someone who has understood that the public performance is a professional task, even when it draws on genuine qualities. They saw Charles making his own preparations, his own internal adjustments, his own performance of the marriage that he was also, in his way, trying to hold together, or at least to hold the appearance of together, for reasons that were not only image management, but that included a genuine if complicated wish not to cause the catastrophe he could see approaching. And then they saw what happened after, when the car door closed and the cameras were behind them, when the performance could be released and what was underneath it surfaced. Not always dramatically, not always loudly. Sometimes just in the quality of the silence in the car on the way home, in the two people sitting in separate atmospheres within the same vehicle, and the staff in the front practicing the professional deftness that the back seat required. The household held all of this. It continued to function because functioning was what it was built for. The silver was polished, the schedules were maintained, the flowers were fresh, the meals were prepared and served and cleared with the impeccable efficiency that royal households produce, because royal households have centuries of practice at maintaining the surface, while the interior does whatever the interior does. But the interior was doing something that the surface was having increasing difficulty containing. The staff could feel it in the way they could feel the approach of the morning that was going to be difficult before the morning fully arrived, in the quality of the house's atmosphere in the evenings, in the particular silence that settled over the building when both principals were present but apart, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath in those moments, as if it too understood that something was building and that the building was approaching a point at which the surface and the interior were going to stop being separable. That point was coming. The staff knew it. They had known it for some time in the way that people who live inside something know things that people on the outside cannot access. They knew it in their bones in the way of professionals who have read the signs long enough to trust the reading, even when the signs have not yet assembled themselves into anything officially nameable. The marriage was ending, not yet in the official sense, not yet in the announced and formal and legally processed sense, but in every sense that the staff could directly observe, the marriage had already ended. What remained was the management of its remains, and the management of remains is its own particular kind of work, with its own particular kind of cost, and the people required to perform it were the people who had been performing everything else. The staff, who knew first, who always knows first, who carried the knowledge the way they carried everything in that house, with their backs straight and their faces arranged, and their professional neutrality intact, and who went home at the end of the day and put it down, as much as it could be put down, and returned the next morning to pick it up again, because that was the job, and the job did not end simply because the marriage had. There is a difference between someone who finds themselves at war and someone who has decided to go to war. The first is a condition imposed from outside, something that arrives without invitation, and that the person inside it responds to as best they can with whatever resources they have available. The second is a choice, a deliberate, considered, strategically executed choice made by someone who has assessed the situation they are in and concluded that the only way to change it is to fight for the change with everything available to them and to fight in a way that the opponent cannot easily defend against. Diana went to war. This requires saying clearly, and without the softening that the romantic version of her story tends to apply to everything she did in those years. She did not simply find herself in conflict with the palace, she chose conflict with the palace. She chose it with the strategic intelligence of someone who had been studying her opponent for a decade, and who understood, with a clarity that her public image of vulnerability somewhat obscured, exactly where the institution was most exposed, and how to apply pressure to those exposures most effectively. The institution was most exposed in the place it was most invested in protecting. Its image, its narrative, the carefully managed story it told about itself through the management of royal appearances and royal statements, and the long accumulated authority of an institution that had survived for centuries by ensuring that the story it told about itself was the only story available. Diana understood this because she had been living inside the story for 10 years, and she had watched it being produced from the inside, and she knew exactly the gap between the production and the reality. She was going to use that gap. She was going to open it wider. She was going to invite the world inside it. The staff saw this campaign from the inside. They saw it being constructed, and they saw it being executed, and they lived inside its consequences in the specific and unglamorous way that people live inside consequences when they are not the ones who made the decisions that produced them. They were the geography of the war again, as they had been the geography of the failing marriage. The household was the terrain, and they were the people moving through it, while larger forces used it for purposes that had nothing to do with the silverware and the schedule and the correct arrangement of flowers in the entrance hall. The relationship with Andrew Morton was not known to the staff in its full form at the time it was developing. This is important to establish. The secret of Diana's cooperation with Morton and the specific nature of her contribution to what would become Diana, her true story, was maintained with a discretion that was, in its way, one of the most professionally impressive things Diana managed in those years. The tapes she recorded, speaking directly and at length into a recorder provided by Morton and then returned to him through intermediaries, were produced in a privacy that the household did not penetrate. What the staff saw was the aftermath, the behavior around the production, the telephone calls that preceded and followed the recording sessions, the quality of Diana's mood in the periods when the project was active compared to the periods when it was dormant. They saw a woman who was, during those months, energized in a specific way that was different from the ordinary energy of her public appearances. There was a purposefulness to it, a direction, the sense of someone moving toward something rather than simply moving, which was itself different from the quality of her energy in the years of the marriage's deterioration, when the movement had often felt like the movement of someone who was moving to prevent herself from being still because stillness was too frightening. The book was published in June 1992. Its publication was a detonation inside the institution. This is not a metaphor chosen for effect. It was the word that the palace insiders who described that period reached for consistently when they tried to account for the experience of it. A detonation, something that produced structural damage that was immediately visible, and further damage that only became apparent over time as the shock continued to move through the building. The book said things that the palace had depended on not being said. It described Diana's suicide attempts. It described her bulimia. It described her isolation and her despair and her understanding of the marriage she was inside in terms that were specific and detailed and sourced in a way that left no serious question about where the information had come from, even before Diana eventually confirmed her cooperation. It described Charles and Camilla in language that required the public to stop maintaining the polite uncertainty about the nature of that relationship that the public had until then been willing to maintain because the alternative was uncomfortable. It was a controlled explosion. That was what the staff came to understand in the weeks and months after publication. It was not the act of someone who had lost control and was simply releasing everything. It was the act of someone who had selected carefully, who had decided what to give and what to withhold, who had shaped the narrative with a sophisticated understanding of what the public would absorb and what it would use and what effect the using would have on the institution she was fighting. The selection was revealing in itself. Diana gave Morton the suffering, the vulnerability, the evidence of how the palace had failed her and how the marriage had damaged her and how the institution had treated her humanity as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a reality to be engaged with. She gave him the things that would produce sympathy in the public and damage to the palace. She withheld the things that would have complicated the sympathy or reduced the damage. She withheld the campaign. She withheld the calculation. She withheld herself as a strategic actor and presented herself as a victim, which she was, genuinely, in many of the ways the book described, and also as something more complex that the book's framing did not accommodate. The staff lived inside the consequences of the publication with the professional composure that was required of them and the private processing that composure required them to do elsewhere and later. The household in the weeks after publication was not a comfortable place. The tension that had always been present was now at a different register, amplified by the public nature of the conflict and by the institutional response to the public nature of the conflict, which was the response of an organization that has been damaged and knows it and is deciding what to do about it and has not yet decided. Diana's behavior toward the staff in those weeks was, by the accounts of those who were present, erratic in ways that were connected to the emotional intensity of what she had set in motion. There were days of extraordinary energy and brightness, the energy of someone who has done something significant and is living in the space immediately after the doing of it, where the full consequences have not yet arrived, but the sense of having acted is still fresh and sustaining. And there were days of a different quality, days when the consequences were beginning to arrive, and the sustaining quality of the action was meeting the reality of what the action had cost. What it had cost included things Diana had perhaps not fully calculated: the institutional protection that the palace extended to its members, the discretion that surrounded their medical and personal lives,
the management of security and legal issues that the palace machinery handled as a matter of course. All of this became more complicated in the aftermath of a publication that had declared, in the clearest possible terms, that the member in question was in open conflict with the institution. The palace did not withdraw its obligations suddenly or dramatically. It did not operate with that kind of directness. It operated the way it always operated, through the gradual adjustment of arrangements and the subtle shift of resources and the quiet withdrawal of the specific warmth that the institution extended when it wished to and did not extend when it did not wish to.
The staff felt these adjustments in the texture of their daily work. Instructions came through different channels. The coordination between Diana's household and the wider palace apparatus became more formal and more distant and more characterized by the precise professional language that organizations use when they are managing a relationship that has become adversarial. The warmth between Diana's people and the broader palace people cooled in ways that were not announced and not addressed, and were therefore more difficult to respond to than anything that could have been directly confronted. Diana noticed all of this. Her noticing of it produced in her household a mood that the staff navigated with the familiar, careful choreography of their daily work. She was angry in the slow, sustained way that is different from the sharp anger that discharges itself in a moment and then is over. She was watchful. She was assessing the field of the battle she had opened and recalibrating her position within it, and the recalibration was sometimes expressed outward, and the outward expression landed on the people nearest to her, which was the staff. A private secretary who was trying to coordinate with the wider palace on a matter of scheduling found himself in those months in the position of intermediary between two parties who were conducting their exchange through the formal language of bureaucratic coordination, while everyone involved understood that the bureaucratic language was a container for something significantly more charged. He performed this role with the professional competence it required. He absorbed from both sides the pressures that his position generated. He went home, and he managed what he carried, and he came back the next morning. This was palace service in those years. This was what it looked like from the inside. The formal separation was announced in December 1992, 6 months after the Morton book. It was announced by the Prime Minister John Major in the House of Commons, which was itself a statement about the degree to which a private marriage had become a public and constitutional matter. The announcement said that the separation was amicable and that there were no plans for divorce, and that both principals would continue to carry out their public duties. It said the things that announcements of this kind are designed to say, which are the things that manage the immediate public response, without providing the information that would make the management of subsequent public responses impossible. The staff heard the announcement through the same channels as the public. They already knew what the announcement was about. They had known it for considerably longer than the public had, and in considerably more detail, and with the specific knowledge of the interior of it that no announcement could convey. What the announcement gave them was the official version. The frame around the picture they had been living inside. The formal separation produced a practical reorganization of the household that was in some ways a relief after the years of managing two separate operations under the fiction of a unified one. The households separated more explicitly. The staff arrangements were reorganized to reflect the actual rather than the official situation. People who had been serving both principals now served one or the other. Spaces that had been nominally shared were officially distinguished. The bureaucratic and domestic architecture of the separation was constructed with the palace's considerable organizational capacity, and the result was a clarity of structure that the preceding years had not had. What the structure could not clarify was Diana, because Diana in the separation was not a simplified Diana. She was not a Diana freed from the constraints of the marriage into something more straightforward and less demanding. She was a Diana who had been fighting a war and who had achieved a significant victory in the form of the separation, and who now had to determine what the next phase of the war looked like and what resources it required. The resources it required included the continued management of her public image
and the continued cultivation of the media relationships that made the image management possible. It included the ongoing project of positioning herself as the more sympathetic party in the separation and in the broader narrative of the marriage's failure.
It included ensuring that the public understanding of the separation was the understanding that served Diana's interests, and not the understanding that would have served Charles's interests or the palace's interests. This project continued with the sophistication and the purposefulness that had characterized the Morton phase. Diana's media relationships deepened in the years after the separation. She was selective in her access and deliberate in her provision of it, and the selectivity and the deliberateness were themselves managed with the care of someone who understood that visible strategy undermined the effectiveness of the strategy. She needed to appear spontaneous. She needed to appear as someone responding to circumstances rather than shaping them. She was, in fact, shaping them constantly and with considerable skill. The staff in the separated household observed this management with the same full view they had always had of the distance between the presented version and the operational reality. They saw the preparation before the spontaneous moments. They saw the calls that preceded the convenient encounters. They saw the relationship between Diana's expressed emotions and her media management. And they understood that the relationship was not one of simple authenticity, that the emotions were real and the management of them was also real, and that these two things coexisted in ways that required a certain sophistication to hold. They held it because holding it was the job. The Panorama interview was recorded in November 1995 and broadcast on the 20th of that month to an audience of 23 million people in the United Kingdom alone. It was, in the terms of Diana's campaign against the palace, her most significant and her most carefully constructed operation. It was presented as an act of spontaneous honesty. It was, in fact, a production of considerable deliberateness that had been planned and prepared and executed with a precision that the spontaneous framing was specifically designed to obscure. The interview was conducted by Martin Bashir, and the circumstances of its arrangement have subsequently become the subject of significant controversy, including findings that Bashir used deceptive means to secure Diana's cooperation. What is relevant here is not the ethics of Bashir's methods, but the nature of Diana's participation in the enterprise. She was not a passive subject. She was not an innocent who had been manipulated into an interview she did not understand. She was a woman who had decided that a direct address to the public, in her own words, through a medium that would reach the maximum possible audience, was the next necessary move in the war she was conducting. She prepared. This is documented by people who were in proximity to the preparation. She worked on her answers. She thought about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, and what effect the saying would produce in the audience she was addressing. She thought about how she wanted to look, the makeup, the clothing, the physical presentation of a woman who was making a statement, who was performing vulnerability in a way that was also performing strength, who needed to appear unguarded while being in complete control of what the unguardedness revealed. The makeup was done by a professional with whom Diana had a long-standing relationship and who understood the specific requirements of television appearance and the specific requirements of Diana's appearance on this particular occasion. The eyes, the famous eyes, the ones that the cameras had been photographing for 15 years, were made up in a way that emphasized their expressiveness and their depth while maintaining the appearance of minimal artifice. The effect was a face that looked like a face that had not been prepared, which is one of the most technically demanding things professional makeup can achieve. She sat down opposite Bashir, and she delivered a performance that was simultaneously authentic and constructed, genuinely felt and precisely managed, an act of real emotion and real calculation, so thoroughly integrated that separating them was not possible and perhaps not meaningful. She talked about marriage. She talked about Camilla. She talked about her own affairs, acknowledging James Hewitt with an honesty that was itself strategic, because controlling the disclosure was preferable to having the disclosure uncontrolled. She delivered the line about there being 3 people in the marriage that would define the public understanding of the Wales marriage for the years and decades to come. She looked directly into the camera. This was the key, the thing that distinguished the Panorama interview
from everything else she had done in the campaign, and that made it the most powerful single act of the entire operation. She bypassed the institution. She bypassed Charles. She bypassed the palace machinery and the management and the careful bureaucratic language of announcements made through appropriate channels. She looked directly at the 23 million people watching, and she spoke to them directly, and she told them, in the specific and personal terms of someone who has decided to trust the audience with the truth, what had happened to her.
The palace's response was shock. Not because they had not understood that Diana was capable of this. They had understood it, many of them, for some time. The shock was at the scale, at the directness, at the degree to which the careful management of royal narrative, the institutional control over how the family presented itself to the public, had been not merely challenged, but comprehensively circumvented by someone who had spent 15 years learning exactly how the control operated and had used that knowledge to step around it entirely. The staff at Diana's household watched the interview broadcast with the mixed and complicated feelings of people who had been living inside the story it told, and who recognized it and did not recognize it simultaneously. The things it described were real. The suffering was real. The isolation was real. The sense of having been failed by an institution that did not know how to engage with her humanity was real, and the staff who had observed that failure from close range could not dismiss it. And the things it did not describe were also real. The campaign was real. The calculation was real. The management of the presentation of the suffering was real. The strategic deployment of vulnerability as a weapon in an institutional war was real. The staff held all of it in the same internal space they had always used for the complicated knowledge that proximity to Diana generated, the knowledge that did not simplify, that did not resolve into the clean version that the watching millions were receiving, that remained as it had always been, multiple and resistant to the single verdict that everyone outside the house seemed to need. The divorce became inevitable after the Panorama interview. The palace moved toward it with the institutional decisiveness of an organization that has finally decided that managing a situation is no longer viable and that conclusion is preferable to indefinite management. The Queen wrote to Charles and Diana in December 1995 to say that an early divorce was desirable. The letter was, in the careful language of royal correspondence, about as direct as the institution permitted itself to be. An early divorce was desirable. It was a sentence that had been considered for a long time before it was written. The staff in Diana's household received the news of the letter's existence and its contents through the channels that significant institutional information travels in those environments. Not through announcement, through the specific quality of how certain people were moving and what certain telephone calls sounded like, and the atmosphere of rooms in which things had been decided and not yet spoken. They understood what it meant. They had understood what it was going to mean for some time. The war was entering its final phase. The campaign has achieved what campaigns achieve when they succeed, which is not resolution but movement. Things were moving toward a conclusion. The conclusion would not be simple, and would not be clean, and would not be anything like the fairy tale that had been promised at the beginning. But it would be something. It would be an end to the particular state of suspended conflict that the household had been living inside for years. And the staff, professional and discreet, and carrying everything they carried with the composure that the job required, found in that prospect something they recognized as relief, even if relief was not something they were supposed to feel about the legal dissolution of a royal marriage. They were human. Despite everything the job required of them, in the direction of not being human, they were human. And the ending of something terrible is always, even when the ending is also terrible, a kind of relief. The war was almost over. The casualties were not yet fully counted, but they would be. The divorce was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. A piece of paper, a legal conclusion to something that had never been simple enough for legal language to contain. Diana received her settlement, her apartments, her title stripped of the word royal, but not of the weight it carried. She walked out of the institution that had shaped her and damaged her and made her famous, and she walked into a freedom that was real and also terrifying in the way that freedom always is for someone who has spent 15 years defined by captivity. She was 14 months old. On the 31st of August, 1997, in a tunnel in Paris, the most photographed woman in the world died without a camera present. The staff who had served her heard the news the way the rest of the world heard it, in the small hours, through the radio, through the telephone, through the specific silence that follows information too large to immediately process. They grieved, of course they grieved, because they had known her, not the image, not a fairy tale, the woman, the difficult, luminous, wounded, generous, complicated woman who had moved through their lives and left marks that did not fade simply because she was gone. They had seen her whole, and seeing someone whole, with all their light and all their shadow, is the only kind of knowing that makes grief feel like what it actually is, not the loss of a symbol, the loss of a person. She was both. That was always the truth, and it was enough. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. We tell history the way it actually happened, not the way it was packaged for the cameras. Like this video if Diana deserved more than a fairy tale, and drop a comment below. What do you think her legacy really is?